are there states that if you follow guidelines, you can prove that you followed guidelines? Does that get you off the hook as far as malpractice, even if there's a bad outcome?
The short answer, or the law school answer, would be yes. If you follow the standard of care and something goes wrong, and you haven't breached the standard of care, then you're in good shape.
You could still be sued, but you may not lose.
What you've just described, you should win. If you have to breach the standard of care in order to have a successful, or in the doctor's point of view, an unsuccessful result in a malpractice case. So if you followed the standard of care, you can't be sued successfully. You shouldn't lose. That said, there's disagreement about what the standard of care is, and so even though there's published standards, there's other published standards too that might be different, or someone might say, we recognize this is kind of a consensus, but there's a very, this is something that should have been looked at differently, and here's how.
And we both know that the standard of care varies where you live.
Right.
It can vary from town to town or state to state.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think big data and changes that are coming to your practice, that will be great, is that we'll have less of that. I think you and I were chatting about this before. There were some counties, I think in Connecticut, where they did hysterectomies at an unbelievably high rate, and all of the doctors in the hospital probably chatted about what were the reasons why you would do hysterectomies, and they came to a consensus, their standard, that we would do them, and it resulted in lots of hysterectomies. In the few counties over, much lower percentage. Well, they can't both be right. There's a scientific basis that you should do it or you shouldn't, and one of them was right, and what you need is a standard that takes into account all of the data and all of the work that doctors are doing nationwide, so that you don't have medicine being practiced too much by intuition or by anecdote or by chatting with your mates at the cafeteria.
Yeah, there was a case in Western Pennsylvania recently of a doctor who was convicted of prescribing 1.6 million doses of opioids in a 4-month period. And they asked him why he did that, and he said, the people out here have a lot of pain.
That might be true.
The standard of care might be different there, right?
Right. There are standards of care that somehow are not a defense to your behavior.
He prescribed 104 million doses of fentanyl and OxyContin.
Right. Well, you raise one of the other really fascinating issues about medical malpractice, which is, it's been estimated, I think Johns Hopkins has a study that said something like 60% of the malpractice payments come from 6% of the doctors. And that's probably, a problem with opioids too. There's not a few, but there's not very many doctors who are prescribing millions of pills. There might be 50 or 500 or some number that we can get our arms around. And those are big problems, and those are big problems in malpractice as well.
In a recent law said that in a malpractice case that the defendant who loses the case has to pay the tax on legal fees now. Is that true?
I don't think so.
On lawyers' legal fees?
The rule we have in America is called the American Rule, and it says that you are responsible for your own legal fees, win or lose. And so the doctors don't get their fees back if they win a malpractice case, as they usually do. That's not the rule in England, for example, called the English rule, where the loser pays. But we don't have that here.
Well, this is different. I read that, supposing you won $100,000 in a medical malpractice case, and the contingency fee is $30,000. And so the lawyer will deduct $30,000 from the contingency fee, and the plaintiff will wind up with $70,000. I've read that the law changed recently where the plaintiff would then be responsible for paying the tax on that $30,000 that's paid to the lawyer.
Federal tax?
Yeah, I think it was a federal case.
I'm unfamiliar with that. The rule has...
It seems silly.
It's silly, yeah, because it's money you didn't get. But the rule has always been that whatever the money would have been if the malpractice hadn't occurred, that's how the tax law would have treated that, is what happens with the verdict. So, for example, if I had pain and suffering, that's not taxable, and it would never be taxable. On the other hand, if I have lost wages as a part of my lawsuit and I get $50,000 for lost wages, that would have been taxable, and so you have to pay federal tax on the 50. The pain and suffering, you wouldn't.